Scene. A crumbling stable. Joseph knelt before a rusty chest as the roof of the abandoned stable collapsed around him, his trembling hands holding yellowed letters that revealed a forbidden love between a baron and a peasant girl. Bello, a mud-caked black horse, gently nuzzled his shoulder as if understanding that the true treasure was never riches, but the stories that needed to be told. 3 weeks earlier, Joseph Benedict Silva walked the dusty road connecting the farmer's market to his modest home on the outskirts of Oakhaven. A sky heavy with gray clouds threatened another rainy afternoon, and the farmer hurried his pace, carrying on his back a worn canvas sack with the last unsold vegetables of the day. His calloused hands, marked by decades of honest labor, gripped the straps as his thoughts wandered to the loneliness awaiting him at home. At 53, Joseph was known at the market as a man with an easy smile and a generous heart. He always offered a discount to mothers with babies, always set aside the best tomatoes for Mrs. Clementine, the widow who lived alone down the street. But beneath that genuine kindness, he carried the weight of missing Maria, his only daughter, who had left for Chicago 2 years prior seeking better opportunities. The rain began to fall slowly, first in fat drops that splattered the red dust of the road, then in a persistent drizzle that forced Joseph to seek shelter. He knew this area well. He had grown up running through these fields, which he now watched through the curtain of water. He decided to take the shortcut through the old mill, a stone structure that had remained abandoned for decades, covered in vines and surrounded by tall grass swaying in the wind. The mill had been the heart of this region when Joseph's grandparents were children. Stories told of entire families relying on it to grind the corn and wheat that fed the whole community. Now, only ruins remained, like ghosts of a past few remembered. It was as he rounded the tallest stone wall that Joseph heard the first whinny. The sound was muffled, almost a whisper amongst the rain and the wind rustling the leaves. Joseph stopped, pricked his ear. Another whinny, clearer this time, coming from the pasture behind the mill. Following the sound, Joseph pushed aside the tall grass with his hands and saw a sight that chilled him. There, alone in the muddy field, stood a majestic horse, completely covered in dark mud. The animal was black, he could tell from where the rain had washed away the dirt, but what was most striking was the expression in its large, deep eyes, a melancholy that seemed to carry the weight of the world. The horse watched him without fear, but without approaching either. Joseph noticed the animal was thin, its ribs slightly visible beneath its dirty coat. Instinctively, the farmer extended his hand, making the gentle gesture he always used to approach the stray dogs that appeared at the market. "Easy there, boy," he whispered, his voice carrying the same patience he used with the children running between the stalls. "No one's going to hurt you." It was when he drew closer that Joseph saw something that made him take a step back. On the animal's right hind hoof, there was a strange mark, not a common horseshoe, but something that seemed to have been burned into the dark matter of the hoof itself. Even covered in mud, the inscription seemed to pulse with its own light, as if it had been made with burning iron. Joseph couldn't read very well, only enough to do the market accounts and sign his name, but he could make out letters in that mark, Bellotthera, Bellathera. The name echoed in his mind like a distant bell, awakening fragmented memories of stories he had heard in childhood. Tales. The elders whispered on Midsummer Eve about a legendary mare that had belonged to the region's most noble family. The rain intensified, and Joseph made a decision that would change his life. He took off his shirt, the only dry one he had, and offered it to the horse as an improvised towel. The animal allowed him to approach, and as Joseph gently began to wipe the mud from its neck, he felt a tremor run through the animal's body, not of fear, but of gratitude. "Come on, Bello," Joseph said, surprised to pronounce the name so naturally. "Let's go home." Joseph's home was simple, 3 small rooms, a dirt backyard, and a makeshift corral he had built years ago intending to raise some chickens. He never imagined it would house a horse, especially one with such an imposing presence that seemed to diminish the size of everything around it. That first night, Joseph could barely sleep. He stayed by the kitchen window, watching Bello in the corral. The animal remained standing, motionless as a statue, its neck raised and its eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Every now and then, its ears moved, as if it were hearing sounds only it could perceive. It was on the second night that the dreams began. Joseph saw fragments of a time he had never lived. Elegant carriages crossing stone roads, men in top hats and women in full skirts walking through well-kept gardens. And always, at the center of these visions was Bello, young, shining, running free through the fields with an elegance that seemed to defy gravity. But there was something more to those dreams. A woman in white, always seen from afar, who reached out towards the horse and whispered its name with a tenderness that made Joseph's heart race. She never clearly showed her face, but her voice echoed like a sad melody that persisted even after Joseph awoke. During the day, Joseph continued his routine at the farmer's market, but his thoughts were always drawn home. He saved the best carrots for Bello, bought oats with money he should have used to repair his leaky roof. The other vendors began to notice his distraction. "You're different, Joseph," commented Antonio, who sold cheese at the stall next door. "You look like someone who's found a treasure or lost a woman." Joseph smiled, but didn't reply. How could he explain that he had found a horse carrying the name of a legend engraved on its very hoof? How could he talk about the dreams that visited him every night, showing fragments of a past that seemed as real as the present? On the fifth night, Joseph had the most vivid dream. He saw himself walking through the halls of a grand mansion, with walls covered in portraits of austere men and women with serious expressions. At the end of the hall, a double door opened into a ballroom where dozens of people danced to the music of an orchestra, and there, in the center of the dance floor, danced a tall man in a military uniform and a woman dressed in white, the same woman from his other dreams. But this time, Joseph could see her face. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, with brown hair tied in an elegant bun and eyes that shone with genuine joy. When she laughed, the entire ballroom seemed to light up, and when she looked out the window, her eyes always sought the same thing: Bello, grazing freely in the gardens of the estate. Joseph awoke with tears in his eyes, not understanding why that image touched him so deeply. He got up, went to the window, and saw Bello in the same place as always, motionless, vigilant. But this time, when their eyes met, Joseph had the impression that the horse had also dreamed. The next day, Joseph sought out old Beneved, a man in his 80s, who lived alone in a wooden house by the river. Beneved was known in the area as a storyteller, someone who kept in his memory the events of decades past. If anyone could shed light on the mystery of Bello, it would be him. When they finally reached the top of a hill, Joseph saw the ruins of what had once been the d'Albuquerque stud farm. Even in ruins, it was possible to see that it had been a grand building. Stone walls still stood in some places, covered with vines and moss. What remained of the roof lay scattered on the ground, charred wooden beams mixed with broken tiles. Bello stopped at the entrance of what had been the main gate and reared up, neighing loudly for the first time since Joseph had known him. The sound echoed through the ruins like a lament, as if the horse were greeting ghosts of the past. Joseph approached the ruins with reverence, like someone entering a church. He walked among the rubble, trying to imagine what the place had been like in its glory days. There were the remains of the stables, where dozens of horses must have lived. Further on, the foundations of the main house, with its spacious rooms and imposing architecture. It was while rounding what appeared to have been an inner courtyard that Joseph saw something that made him stop. On the ground, half covered by years of dry leaves and debris, there was a stone different from the other. It was smaller, more worked, and when Joseph cleaned it with his hands, he discovered that it had some letters engraved on it: Teso. Joseph's heart pounded. Could it be the beginning of the word treasure? He began to dig around the stone with his hands, then with a sturdy branch he found nearby. The earth gave way more easily than he expected, as if it had been turned over before. After a few minutes of digging, his hands touched something metallic. It was a small chest, the size of a shoebox, made of metal that had once been gold, but was now covered in rust. Joseph carefully removed it from the hole, his heart beating like a drum. It was at that moment that he heard the first crack. One of the beams that still supported part of the main wall had given way, and pieces of masonry began to detach from the partially destroyed ceiling. Joseph looked up and saw that the entire remaining structure was unstable. A sudden movement could cause a collapse, but he couldn't leave without discovering what was in the chest. With trembling hands, he forced the rusty lock until it gave way with a sharp snap. Inside, protected by an oiled cloth that had withstood the passage of time, were dozens of yellowed letters, tied with a faded ribbon that had once been blue. Joseph picked up the first letter. Even with his limited reading, managed to distinguish some words in the delicate handwriting. My dearest Henry, forbidden love, Bello, forever. Another crack, louder this time. Pieces of wood and stone began to fall around Joseph. He should run, but something held him there, kneeling in the middle of the ruins, with those letters in his hands. It was as if he finally understood the importance of what he had found. Then Bello moved. The horse, which had remained at the entrance of the ruins, advanced towards Joseph with a determination that surprised the market vendor. But instead of trying to drag him out, Bello positioned itself between him and the exit, looking at him with almost human intensity. It was as if the horse were saying, "Now you know, now you carry the story. It's your responsibility to decide what to do with it." Joseph understood. He tucked the letters into his shirt pocket, picked up the chest, and slowly rose. At that moment, part of the ceiling collapsed exactly where he had been kneeling seconds before. Dust rose like a cloud, obscuring his vision. When the air cleared, Joseph and Bello were side by side outside the ruins, observing the final destruction of what remained of the stud farm. But Joseph felt no sadness. He felt a strange sense of completeness, as if a cycle had finally closed. That night, by the light of a candle on the kitchen table, Joseph read all the letters. They were correspondence exchanged between Baron Henry and Isabel Maria during the months they fought against the opposition of their families. They weren't letters from rich and privileged people, but from two young lovers who dreamed of a simple and honest life. My dearest Henry, one of the letters read, when I see you riding Bello, running through the fields with the wind in your hair, I know that's how I want to remember you forever. Free, young, far from the constraints your family tries to place on your wrists. And in a letter that had clearly been written in haste, Isabel wrote, if anything happens to us, if they separate us, promise you'll take care of Bello. He's not just a horse, he's proof that love can be stronger than conventions, that beauty can exist even when everything around insists on being ugly. Joseph was moved by these words. He understood that Bello wasn't just a lost animal he had rescued. He was the guardian of a love story that defied prejudices, a symbol of resistance against the social rigidity that tried to determine who could love whom. Stories like this are rare, but they deserve to be told and retold so they never get lost in time. If you have valued these narratives that rescue the humanity behind events, consider subscribing to continue receiving stories that touch the heart and spark reflections on love, courage, and resilience. The next morning, Joseph made another decision that would change his life. Instead of going to his usual spot at the farmer's market, he set up a small stall in front of the church in the central square. On a table borrowed from the sacristy, he displayed Henry and Isabel's letters, carefully protected by glass panes he borrowed from Manuel's shop. Next to the letters, he placed a handmade sign where he had written, in his neat handwriting, learned as an adult, the love story of Bello, the horse that kept a secret for decades. And there, next to the stall, Bello stood, no longer covered in mud, but shining with the black coat Joseph had patiently cleaned and brushed. The horse seemed to understand its new function, no longer a lost animal, but the living protagonist of a story that needed to be told. People began to approach out of curiosity. First came the children, drawn to Bello's imposing presence, then the adults, intrigued by the old letters displayed on the table. Joseph wasn't a born storyteller like Mr. Benavides, but he spoke with a genuine passion that made every word captivating. He told about Baron Henry, a young man who chose love over privilege. He spoke of Isabel Maria, a courageous peasant girl who dared to dream beyond her social standing. And he described Bello not as a simple horse, but as a symbol of everything beautiful and resilient in the human heart. Do you know why this story is important? Joseph asked a group of teenagers who were listening attentively. Because it reminds us that true love doesn't see differences in class, color, or social status, that the courage to follow your heart can change the world, even when everything seems to conspire against us. An elderly lady approached the stall, her eyes brimming with tears. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about Baron Henry," she said. "He said he was different from the other nobles, that he treated the workers with respect. I never knew it was because of love." Joseph smiled. "Love transforms people, Mrs. Maria. It makes us see the world with different eyes to treat everyone as equals." By the end of that first day, Joseph had collected more money from the visitors' voluntary contributions than he usually earned in a week at the farmer's market. But more importantly, he had seen the sparkle in people's eyes when they understood the depth of that story. In the following weeks, Joseph's stall became a mandatory stop in the square. Entire families came to hear Bello's story. Couples in love were inspired by the courage of Henry and Isabel. Children drew pictures of the black horse and brought them to show. But the deepest transformation happened in Joseph himself. He who had spent years feeling invisible, working silently at the market without anyone paying real attention to him, now found himself surrounded by people interested not only in the story he told, but in his own reflections on love, courage, and justice. "Joseph, Mrs. Clementine said, one afternoon, you've changed, you have a sparkle in your eye I haven't seen in years," and it was true. Joseph had found a purpose that went beyond mere survival. He had become the guardian of a story that needed to be preserved, the bearer of a message about the transformative power of true love. One Saturday afternoon, 3 months after finding Bello in the muddy field, Joseph received an unexpected visit. An elegant woman, about 60 years old, approached the stall, accompanied by a man of the same age. There was something familiar about her features, but Joseph couldn't identify what it was. "Are you Joseph?" she asked, her voice thick with restrained emotion. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman looked at Bello, then at the letters displayed on the table, and her eyes filled with tears. "I'm Isabel Maria's granddaughter," she said, her voice trembling. "My grandmother died 10 years ago, but until her last day, she spoke of Baron Henry and a horse named Bello." Joseph felt a shiver run down his spine. "Your grandmother, she never saw the Baron again?" The woman shook her head. "No, after the fire, my family moved to Minas Gerais. My grandmother married my grandfather a few years later, had children, built a new life, but she never forgot her first love. She always said that if she ever returned here, she would look for Bello." She approached the horse reverently. Bello lowered his head, allowing her to touch his mane. "He's here," the woman whispered. "Somehow, he endured all these years." The man accompanying her, her husband, Joseph assumed, spoke for the first time. "My mother-in-law left something in case we ever found Bello. She said it was important." He pulled a small object wrapped in cloth from his pocket. When he unwrapped it, Joseph saw it was an old gold locket engraved with a running horse. "She said this locket belonged to Baron Henry," the man explained. that he had given it to her as a token of his love. She wanted it buried with Bello when the time came. Joseph took the locket with trembling hands. It was fine goldsmith work, clearly made by skilled hands, and on the back there was an inscription that moved him: "To Isabel, my eternal love, Henry." "But you don't understand," said Joseph, his voice choked. "Bello isn't going to die. He'll continue living, telling this story to future generations. This locket isn't meant to be buried, it's meant to be displayed with the letters, so everyone knows that your grandparents' love was real and lasting." Isabel's granddaughter smiled through her tears. "You're right. My grandmother would be happy to know that her story didn't die with her." That night, Joseph added the locket to the display, and the next day, when he told the story to a group of tourists who had come from another town specifically to meet Bello, he included the ending, that true love can be interrupted, but never destroyed. That stories of courage and resilience always find a way to survive, even if it takes decades to resurface. Months passed. Bello's story spread beyond the small town. Journalists came to do reports. A documentary filmmaker made a movie about the discovery of the letters. A publisher became interested in publishing a book with the complete correspondence between Henry and Isabel. But for Joseph, the most important were the quiet moments at the end of each day, when the square emptied and he was alone with Bello. It was in those moments that he felt the almost tangible presence of Henry, Isabel, and all those who had truly loved, defying the conventions of their time. One afternoon, while organizing the letters to put them away after another day of visitors, Joseph heard a familiar voice calling his name. He turned and saw Maria, his daughter, walking towards him with a suitcase in her hand and tears in her eyes. "Dad," she said, running to hug him, "I heard about your story on TV. How could you not tell me you'd found a treasure?" Joseph hugged her tightly, feeling his heart overflowing with emotion. "My daughter, I tried to call you several times, but you were always busy with work." "No, Dad, the treasure isn't the letters or the horse. The treasure is you. It's how you turned an accidental discovery into a life mission. It's the courage you had to tell a love story when the world only wants to hear stories of hate." Maria approached Bello, who received her with the same kindness he showed all visitors. "I've come to stay, Dad. I want to help you take care of this story. I want to learn from you what it means to have a purpose greater than ourselves." Joseph couldn't hold back the tears. For years he had wondered if Maria was proud of him, if she saw value in her father's simple work at the farmer's market. Now he knew that she was not only proud, but wanted to be part of the continuation of that story. In the following months, father and daughter worked together to preserve and publicize Bello's story. Maria, with her formal education and administrative skills, organized a small museum in the colonial house that the city hall had given to the project. Joseph continued as the main storyteller, but now with resources to make it even more impactful. They installed panels with photographs of the stud farm ruins, maps of the area showing the lands that belonged to the Albuquerques, and a timeline that contextualized the love story of Henry and Isabel within the historical events of the time. But the center of everything remained Bello, majestic and patient, receiving affection from children and adults, as if he perfectly understood his role. One day, a historian from the State University sought out Joseph with a discovery that would definitively complete the puzzle. He had found, in the diocese archives, baptismal certificates that proved that Henry and Isabel had actually married, not in the official church, but in a discreet ceremony, celebrated by a progressive priest who sympathized with social causes. They were husband and wife for exactly 2 months, the professor explained, until the stud farm fire and the pressure from their families separated them. But during those 2 months, Henry broke several traditions of the time. He allowed the children of the workers to play in the gardens of the big house. He instituted fairer wages, and he even talked about dividing the lands with those who cultivated them. Joseph smiled at this. It made sense, given everything he'd discovered about Henry's character through the letters. His love for Isabel hadn't just changed his heart, it had awakened his social conscience. And Isabel, Maria asked, what happened to her afterward? According to the records I found, she became a teacher in Minas Gerais. She founded a school for the children of farm workers, at a time when that was considered almost revolutionary. She never had children of her own, but she educated hundreds of poor children for over 40 years. Joseph felt an inexplicable pride hearing this. Isabel had channeled the pain of separation into love for humanity, transforming her personal experience into service to others. It was exactly what he himself had done upon finding Bello. That night, Joseph had a dream unlike any other. He saw himself walking through the town square, but it was transformed. The streets were cobblestone, the houses were colonial architecture, and people dressed in period clothing strolled peacefully. It was as if he were visiting the town as it had been in Henry and Isabel's time. In the center of the square, where his stall now stood, there was a marble fountain, and beside the fountain, Henry and Isabel were talking, she stroking Bello's mane, while he read aloud from a book. When Joseph approached, they saw him and smiled. "Thank you," Henry said, extending his hand, "for returning our story to the world. Thank you for showing that love can conquer prejudice," Isabel added, "for proving that stories of hope still find ears willing to listen." Joseph awoke with a sense of peace he had never experienced. He understood that his mission wasn't just to tell a story, it was to demonstrate that the courage to love above social conventions still exists, still transforms lives, still inspires other people to be better. On the first anniversary of Bello's discovery, the small town organized a festival in the square. People came from neighboring towns, journalists, historians, and even some distant descendants of the Albuquerque family, who offered public apologies for the prejudices of their ancestors. But the most moving moment happened when Mr. Benavides, now 85 years old, and aided by a cane, approached Joseph at the end of the celebration. "My son," the old man said, his voice still firm despite his age, "when you came to ask me about Bello that day, I knew something special was going to happen, but I never imagined it would be as beautiful as this." "You always knew it was true, didn't you?" Joseph asked. Benavides smiled. "I saw Bello with my own eyes when I was a boy. I saw Baron Henry riding her, running through the fields, as if she were flying, and I also saw the sadness in both their eyes after Isabel left. Some images you never forget." The old man paused, looking at the crowd that still clustered around the horse. "But what makes me happiest is seeing that you didn't just find Bello, you found your own purpose. Sometimes, we need to rescue the stories of others to understand our own." Joseph nodded, understanding the depth of those words. He had begun this journey as a lonely market vendor, who was just trying to help an abandoned animal. Now he saw himself as the guardian of a message about love, courage, and social transformation that touched hundreds of people. When the festival ended, and the square emptied, Joseph was once again alone with Bello, but this time, Maria was by his side, and the two silently contemplated the horse that had changed their lives. "Dad," Maria said softly, "what do you think will happen when she's no longer here?" Joseph stroked the horse's neck, feeling under his hands the strength and wisdom accumulated over decades. "My daughter Bello has transcended her physical form. She has become a symbol of something greater, of the human capacity to love beyond barriers, to resist injustice, to transform pain into purpose. Symbols like that never die." And as if she had heard and understood every word,
Bello raised her head toward the full moon shining over the square, neighing softly, no longer the melancholic sound of the first days, but something that sounded like gratitude, like a blessing being bestowed. Joseph understood at that moment that he had found more than a lost horse in the muddy field that rainy afternoon. He had found his own story, his own worth, his own ability to make a difference in the world. Bello had been the catalyst, but the transformation had happened within him. A few weeks later, Joseph received a letter that deeply moved him. It was from a young teacher from another town, who had brought her students to learn about Bello's story. She wrote, "Mr. Joseph, I want to thank you for showing us that stories of true love still exist and still deserve to be told. After visiting your museum, my students started researching stories from their own families. We discovered that each of them has episodes of courage, resilience, and love that deserve to be preserved. You didn't just save the story of Henry and Isabel, you taught us that every life has a valuable story waiting to be discovered." Joseph kept that letter along with Henry and Isabel's love letters, because he understood that his mission had multiplied. It was no longer just to tell a story, but to inspire other people to value their own stories, to see beauty and meaning in the simplest human experiences. And so, as the sun set over the small town, Joseph sat on his porch, watching Bello graze peacefully in the backyard. The horse no longer needed to be in the corral. She had become part of the family, part of the community, part of a larger story that would continue to be told long after all the protagonists had passed away. The golden brand on the mare's flank had become a symbol of eternal love. The yellowed letters, testament to the fact that courage can conquer prejudice, and Joseph himself, living proof that it's never too late to discover our true purpose in the world. That night, Joseph didn't dream of the past. He dreamt of the future, of children who would grow up hearing Bello's story and learning that true love knows no bounds. He dreamt of young couples who would draw inspiration from the courage of Henry and Isabel to face their own struggles. He dreamt of a world where stories of hope were valued more than stories of hate. And when he awoke the next morning, with Bello's first soft whinny greeting the new day, Joseph knew he had found more than a treasure buried in the ruins of the past. He had found proof that some loves are too great to die, and that each of us has the power to transform pain into beauty, loneliness into purpose, and simple chance encounters into stories that touch the heart of humanity. The question that had marked the end of the original story echoed now with new meaning. What story would you tell if your name were etched on your skin forever? Joseph had discovered the answer. He would tell the story of the love that resisted time, of the courage that defied conventions, and of the hope that transforms ordinary lives into extraordinary legacies.